So today we're talking about how we're going to go around posing a character and then creating a screen grab or a render of the character. As I said before, the procedure that we want to go through with putting a character into a certain emotional or contextual state is to first of all feel what it is that you're trying to convey. So the example I was demonstrating before was the example of fear. And we've got here listed scared, worried, sleepy and excited. And whilst I can't show this on the screen recording, what I'll be doing is getting up out of my chair and feeling that particular emotion. Now I've done that before and I already have a fairly good idea in my head as to what that relates to inside my body. Now let me just get up a notepad. Where's the word pad? And once I've done that, and it sounds a little bit procedural, but it's good to do a stock take, and you won't always do this, but just to start off with, just do a stock take of what you think all of the different body parts are doing, because in a way, we have to think of what's happening to each one of these controllers throughout the body and do something to every single one of them. Not just do things to the ones which we think best convey the feeling that we're trying to achieve, which is a bit of a trap that you can fall into when we're not trying to see the whole picture. So it's completely up to you as to how you do this, but given the nature of these rigs, the nature of the way they work, and especially with the default setup where it's got the feet in IK mode, meaning that they're stuck to the ground, it's a good idea to start from the feet and work your way up through the torso and eventually get out to your arms and your head afterwards. So as I was exploring before when I was posing, if I start with my, in this case it's the character's green foot, the character's left foot, I had my left foot out in front of me, and again, I'm not just going to trust my memory of this one, I'll get out into the pose and do the pose again, feel what's going on with my character, and think about the configuration of the feet as a starting point. So the way I'm seeing myself at the moment, I've got the weight on my back leg, and my back leg is rotated backwards or outwards. It's back below my center of gravity. My forward foot is in front and slightly out to the side, and the important thing that I was feeling was that I was pointing my toe in a way. I felt that my toe was pointed out in front of me. So we can start by exploring what we've got here in terms of controls to achieve that pose, because every rig is going to be different, but there should be something that is going to allow that to happen. And even if there isn't a controller, you can also not forget that you can just fully rotate the foot as an option. So here, having my foot out in front of me, and have a look at it from here as well, and then jump out into your pose again and think, is that what I'm doing? Okay, I've got here, again you can't see, sorry the microphone's a bit far away, but if this is my pose, I've got that foot and can look down where my foot is, and now as a revisit of that pose, I'm now feeling that whilst I've pointed my toe in that pose, I'm feeling that the ball of my foot is actually planted on the ground, something that I didn't do in my pose before. So I go back to my rig and I think, well, that's not really what I was feeling, so what can I do to get that feeling? So there I've got my foot, and I might rotate that back down again, back down to the ground, and I'm not getting, the foot is on the ground. This is another important thing you have to remember when you're working with a 3D rig, is that if they do things which don't seem to make sense, the foot's on the ground, it says translate is 0, which means it should be on the ground, and yet it's off the ground. In my mind, that means that it's something else preventing it from being on the ground. So if I move my body down, then that's allowing the foot to be on the ground, which is something that I expected to see. And again, we're working up through the chain, so I'm going to keep moving it down until I see that feeling that I was expecting of the ball of the foot being on the ground. Don't believe that just because you place a controller in a certain position, it should be able to do a certain thing. If it doesn't, it means that there's something else in the holistic representation of that pose which is preventing that from happening. So again, now I look at my feet, look at my other foot, and I could probably say, well, that might be a little bit even more bent out, and I jump back into my pose again. Let's go through it. So the next thing I'm feeling is that I do have my weight firmly over my back leg, and my hips are twisted kind of halfway between those 2 feet there. So here at the moment you can see that my hips are facing absolutely straight forward. And another thing, before we go too far forward, I'm using the default my rotation, which is not a good thing to do. It's okay for our posing, but when we do animation, it's going to be not the best thing in the world. So you can double click on the rotation tool, and you've got 3 different ways that you can rotate an object. You can rotate it based upon what it's currently parented to, which is very bad. You can rotate it based upon the world, so it's always rotating based upon the XYZ axis of the world, or you can rotate it relative to itself, which is the gimbal, which is the correct one to use. And I think I've shown this before, and it's something we're going to keep coming back to time and time and time again, because it's not the simplest of things to get your head around, but the best way of thinking about this is that the rotation in gimbal has a direct correlation to these numbers here. So if I was rotating in X, it only rotates just in one axis. If I rotate in Y, it only rotates around the Y-axis only. So there's a change in these things here will result in a change in only one of those numbers at a time. If you use the default rotation, which is the local one, where are we? There it is. You'll see that there's a yellow circle around the outside. If you see the yellow circle, that's not good. Not only that, but when you rotate something, see how all 3 numbers change? You don't get clear rotations in one axis only. So whenever I try to pose a character, I like to use gimbal. Now, pulling out this menu here is a bit of a pain. So an easier way to do that is to hold down the letter E and then press your left mouse button. And if you do that, it gives you all the options. E is what you normally press to bring up the rotation tool anyway. W for translate, E for rotate, R for scale. So if you hold down the letter E and then press your left mouse button, a little menu pops up which allows you to choose the way that you're going to rotate. And the one that you need to choose, as a general rule, if you want to be a happy animator for the rest of your career, is gimbal. It's one of those things that even if you don't get it now, if you suck it and see, you'll thank me later on. If you just say, well, I find it easier to move things in local, that's fine. You do get the ease as a beginner, but you don't get the professionalism and the good result in the long term. So anyway, now when I rotate my body in Y, it's only rotating in one axis only. So I'm posing my pelvis so that it faces somewhat in between those 2 feet. And we're being holistic, so I look at this and say, well, there's something wrong with my knees now. The knees aren't really going where my feet are. So I could either hop up into my pose again, think, well, if I'm doing this, where are my knees? And knees are pretty simple because knees generally point somewhat in the same position as your toes. It's possible to twist your knees if your feet are locked on the ground in a different position, but if your knees or if your feet are not completely locked to the ground, as is the case with my front foot, then having the knees in a different position is going to directly affect the way that my toe is pointing. So 99 times out of 100, when your foot is pointing in a certain direction, your knee will point in more or less the same direction. So the rule of thumb is you can see where your foot is pointing and you have your knee more or less in the same direction. So here I've got my foot pointing out to the side there, but my knee is pointing forwards. So if you want to have a nice looking pose, have the knee also pointing out in the same direction as the foot. Okay, so I've got the foot there at the front, but now I felt as well that I was carrying all of the weight on one foot. So I'm going to transfer my weight over that back foot to have that feeling as though I'm holding my body over that back foot. Do you see how I'm walking through the body? I'm not just thinking about, oh, the bit which grabbed me the most was the face, so I'll start from the face. Start from the floor and work your way upwards. So I've got to this position now where I've got my pelvis in this right orientation, but now that I'm here, I feel like my pelvis is actually, it's not straight like my character is, straight up and down. I've actually got my pelvis twisted forward. There's this forward twist through the pelvis this way. So the next thing I can do is to have a look at my pelvis and what I can do to twist it. So there's two ways you can twist your pelvis. One is that you can just use the actual overall controller like that, which is a good way to work. But another way to work is to use the Elvis Presley one, which is this one here. So you can shake your booty. What do they call it? Twerking. He can twerk.
Oh, God.
I'm getting so educated now. God, last time I typed in what does twerking mean on YouTube. Ooh, okay. Anyway, so you can twerk using the twerk controller. That's what we'll call it, the twerk controller. Or you can just control the whole body and do it that way. But the problem or the advantage, depending on the way you look at it, is that it does take the rest of the body with it. So here, if I was to just push that back, that gives me a feeling of trying to distance myself from whatever it is that I'm afraid of. But just to be complete, I'm going to twist my whole body back and see how I go with that one. So there's several things that I'm doing here. I'm getting my body weight over that foot, but I'm also now twisting that part of my body backwards. The next thing I want to ask myself is, how am I oriented in general? I've got this feeling of this pose back here. I've got if I was to have my arms straight out in front of me, I'm facing generally, I'm actually facing this way. Even though my pelvis is facing that way, my body is facing forwards. Okay, so that's an interesting thing that you can look at now. So, but the question I ask myself is, I'm facing forwards to this thing which is frightening me, and yet my pelvis is facing that way. I can feel that if I had my belt buckle and if I had stuck a pin through my shot in the belly button with an arrow, the arrow would be facing that way. And yet, if I had an arrow through my chest, that one's facing forwards. So there's a definite twist in my spine from the pelvis, which is facing stage right, to my chest, which is facing the front of the screen. So how do we achieve a twist through the whole body? These things at the back here are called FK spine controls. Now, the first thing that I can say for sure is that my body is twisted forwards. But it's twisted forwards and it's still facing that side of the room. And I said before that it was facing forwards. Now, you can select each one of these individually and then rotate them one at a time, but it never has as good a result as if you select all three at the same time. So if I was to then rotate all three at the same time, notice that my pelvis still faces out that way, but my chest faces forwards. And so I'm selecting all three of them, and every single one of them I'm rotating, and it has a cumulative effect of, for starters, it results in a nice smooth line through the body, and you never end up with very severely twisted bodies sections. So I could do that, and you end up with a very unusual, unpleasant change in shape. By selecting all three at the same time, just as a rule and as a habit to stick by until you feel comfortable to change that rule, it will result in a nice body shape that's easy and predictable. So we've worked our way through. We've got our Elvis Presley thing here, which I can maybe push a little bit further, but most of the changing is through the hips, the actual whole body. And then I've twisted my spine up, and I'm always doing a check. I'm doing a check on my body to make sure that that feeling that I had before of, that's way too much in the pelvis now, of having my weight over this back foot, really feel that my bum is completely over my right foot behind me, is still being maintained as I go through. Because every time you add something new, something's going to dilute that. So I still feel that the weight is over there. And another way of judging where your weight is, as well as thinking about where your chin is. So if I was to say, where is my weight over, I can feel it over my back foot. And where is my chin? Sure enough, my chin is over my back foot. Okay, most of the time, whenever we are balancing ourselves, a point of our balance generally tends to be our chin, and our chin will fall over whatever it is that's supporting the center of our mass. It's not always the case, it's just one of those little checkpoints that if you're doing a normal pose, then you can expect to see either your neck or your chin to be somewhat over your center of mass. So it doesn't mean you have to change your pose to enforce that rule, you just have that more of a guide. So here's my chin, there's my back foot, I'm feeling that weight is over that foot there. And here, I'm noticing that my leg is a bit bent there, and yet when I was doing this myself, I wasn't feeling so much of a bend on my leg, and actually felt that my leg was a bit forward. So we always go back and check, revisit, reevaluate, say, well, that's probably a bit more what my pose felt like. I felt that the front part of my leg was more of an angle. Okay? And always going back, always checking, always revisiting. So now I could perhaps go in and have a look at what's happening with the rest of my body. This control up here is a separate way of controlling your upper body instead of using your FK back controls where I'm rotating each section of the back one by one. Some people prefer to just forget them altogether and just use this IK control for the top of the back with various results. But personally, I would tend to, wherever possible, use FK. IK where things are locked to the ground, so your feet are in IK, absolutely use that one. But your hands are free, they're not attached to anything. So unless they were specifically grabbing onto an object like the corner of a door handle while they were looking fearfully around the corner of a door, then you would try to use an IK handle to get a good feeling of connection to an object. But if a person's just fearful and holding that pose, then you don't really want to have much else going on besides just the free open arms. So we've done this. I've got my chest in this position now where I feel like I'm moving forwards. I could either continue through and then get my whole of my head oriented in the right direction, or I could continue through with my arms. But we'll do the head next. In the same way as with your spine, you do all the spine sections together, it's also a fairly good idea to select the neck and the head at the same time to pose things. So here we're going to have actually a bit of an opposing motion, so maybe it won't work with the two separated. We want to have almost a, I felt when I was doing this that there's a crick in the back of my neck, so as I'm doing this I feel that there's actually a strong bend in the back of my neck, so my head's bent forward, and that's exhibits some of the quality of the fearful state that I was in. Oops. And you could probably exaggerate that further by pushing that neck down further and maybe twisting this up a little bit so there's more of a feel of, and here we could probably also do something a bit more in the back. Okay, so now that's extended it through my spine and into my head. Now, only thing I've got left to do now is to think about my arms. Now, one of the things that you need to think about when you're doing your arms in particular, which is always, it's the most important part of any performance beyond the face, I believe, and this is just my own personal opinion, what your shoulders are doing. A lot of people pose their arms and they think that they're just posing their arms and they don't worry about their arms, but if you see your arms in a particular position, a lot of what gives them the character is not the way that the arms are positioned, but the way that the shoulders are. If the shoulders are down here, or the shoulders are up here, it completely changes the character. Whereas if the arms are up here, or down there, or whatever they're doing, they don't add character to your pose, whereas the shoulders do. So when I'm in this scared pose, I'm sitting there looking at stuff, and I've raised my shoulders up around my head. So your shoulders in this character are called the clavicles, and they generally should be called the clavicles. And in this character, they're controlled by rotating. So I'm going to rotate my clavicles up and probably forward as well. To really hunch them forward. So see how rolling those shoulders has pushed them to the front of the chest. Okay, I'll just undo that and see the difference. So this is the normal position of the shoulders down there, and then when we roll them forwards, they come up closer to the head, and they start to round around the front of the chest. That's not a proper anatomical model, but it does the important thing, which is to give this feeling of these shoulders coming up closer to the head. So that's always an important thing to start off when you're thinking about your character, is what are your shoulders doing? And once you've done that, then you just need to think through your arms forward, going down. So imagine I was in the same position. How do I get my arm down there? I twist it down to the side there, and then I rotate that one up, and then I twist that one round, and then I do stuff with my fingers. With this hand here, what I'm doing is I'm bending that arm down to my side, bending my wrist up, twisting my shoulder, bending my other wrist around, and then doing stuff with my fingers. Okay, so it's not always 100% intuitive as to how to get something in an FK approach, but the result is always better. So here, and one of the things I found as well is because there's only one way of rotating your lower arm, you can't hold the arm and rotate it any other way without breaking something. I find that if you rotate your arm, if you know it's going to be something like a right angle, get it towards that rough shape first. So if I'm doing this, I can see that that's not a 90 degree, that's a 90 degree angle, that's a bit lower than a 90 degree angle. Get it into that basic shape that you want, and that way you'll find that as you start to move your shoulders around, it will make more sense as to how far you have to move your shoulders and what you have to do with your shoulders to get that shape happening. So here, across your hand, that curves across my body, and my fingers are going to curve as well. And if I've overdone it with my clavicles, that's fine. We can push them back a bit so that I don't have my arm going into my body, although I don't mind that. We can't actually move with this rig. Other rigs, you can actually move the clavicles around. This one has a fixed clavicle, but that's fine. We're mostly interested in the silhouette and the way it looks. So here I had my arm down to my side, firmly down to my side, and almost my elbow hugging the side of my body. So I'll do it about to there, and then this part was curling around. It wasn't necessarily touching my chest, but it was coming close to my chest. And I'll go a bit up as well. And on this side, I had the other hand in front of that one. Okay, so we'll again get that approximate shape of the arm from the wrist downwards, and then work out what's happening with that arm by moving my shoulder around. Okay, because most of the movement, most of the configuration of the body is going to be achieved by the way that we position our shoulder. This bottom half of our hand, there's not much you can really do with it. Once it's bent in one angle and bent in that angle there, all the motion of your arm comes from your shoulder. It doesn't come from your wrist or your elbow. So that position that we get into is largely determined by what you do with your shoulder. So that's why you need to get that bottom half right. And the reason I say that is because it is possible to achieve all sorts of weird and wacky poses just by twisting my elbow and my wrist around. I can try and create those sorts of shapes, but they're not going to be the right shapes, and they're not going to animate well. So better to get that part of the arm functionally working the way it should be, and then get the motion through the shoulders, than to try and animate your wrists and your hands, because you're always going to be doubling up in your work. So here, because he's shocked, we're going to do something with the fingers being splayed. So I'll move the fingers out a little bit, and these are all done one by one. And I was again feeling with my hands as to what that felt like, that feeling of tension, and I've got a bit of a bend throughout each one of those fingers. So I'm clicking on one of these little circles here, holding down Shift and clicking on another one, and then rotating them all at the same time. And maybe to be interesting, I might put more of a bend on just one of the fingers and not the other one. Okay, so that's a subtle bend across all of them. That one has a bit of a kink on that one. And with my thumb, I might just do that. Maybe something else. Just so there's a feeling of it's a tense feeling. Okay, it's not this nice smooth ballet hands. It's bent at different angles. So here as well, on this one, have them at different angles. And maybe this one here will have more of a feeling of tension to it instead of the other one. And that one could be more smooth. And the fingers shouldn't allow you to do that, but they do. That's not something a finger can do. So try to remember that. That just helps to achieve this mysterious concept of appeal. When things are broken with a 3D rig, it becomes unappealing. Now, this is what I got from my analysis of the pose. Then we have to think back to what we said about clarity. Now, with this particular pose, do I feel that I'm getting the same sort of clarity of the pose that I wanted to? Do I feel that this person is fearful, or what's going on? And I don't really feel that at the moment. I feel that there is perhaps a certain amount of that, but what's getting me here is perhaps the pose, the way that I'm looking at this, and perhaps even the camera angle is not allowing me to read it. So here, from this particular angle, I may have a feeling as though they're fearful, but I don't feel that I'm reading this properly. Now, and one thing that we can do here to get this silhouette that I was talking about, I'll hide the grid, and I'll hide curves as well. If I press 7, I get a feature inside of Maya called the fully lit version. The numbers in Maya, if you press 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7, give different shaded results. 1, 2, and 3 are mainly to do with the resolution of polygons and NURBS objects, but 4 will give you the a wireframe representation of your character. 5 will give you flat shaded. 6 will give you any textured patterns that you might have applied to your character. And 7 gives you lighting. Now, that's all well and good if you've got lights in your scene. If I have a light in my scene, it will show you the lights and what they will approximately look like. If I've got a point light, it shows you the way that the lights will look. And that's great, but that's not the reason why I'm showing you this. The reason I'm showing you this is because if you press 7, it also gives you your silhouette. It gets rid of all of the surface detail, and you can instantly say, does this person look frightened? And in my opinion, he says, no, it looks like he's about to start boxing. This is the ambiguity of a silhouette. And it's your challenge as an animator to try and move this around until you get to a position where you feel that the silhouette is giving more of a feel of that emotion that you're trying to convey. And if you're not getting what you want, then you maybe have to go back and get your controllers and do something which is going to change the way that that pose looks and convey that more clearly. Okay, so maybe just moving the arms ever so slightly, or here perhaps I'm getting a bit of overlap on the feet. The feet are perhaps too far in one direction. I might just open that out a little bit just so there's a clear opening between the legs, and that might help to convey that feeling. Also looking up at the head now, this is where we start to polish and say, well, the head doesn't really feel fearful as such. I might get the character's head perhaps looking a little bit more towards the camera, and then turn that off and say, well, now does that start to feel a bit more fearful? Maybe it's not. Maybe I need more of a bend in the spine if that's going to really convey that a lot better. So here we run into a bit of a problem because I've got this nice position, but I don't want to lose the angle that I'm working at, the angle that I'm looking at my character. So there's a thing in Maya called a bookmark. Let me show you how they work. Inside your camera panel, you've got menus. Unlike the menus at the top here, there's actually a little set of menus specifically that relate to the camera. And under the first set of menus, you've got a menu called View, and at the bottom of the view, or halfway down, you have a thing called bookmarks. And bookmarks are used to remember a particular way that a camera is pointed. So in the current camera, we're looking at the perspective camera. And what I can do is I can open up the bookmark folder, edit bookmarks. And if I want to remember this particular camera angle, I can just click New Bookmark. And then it remembers that view. And the way that works now is if I was to go round to do something with my spine, say I wanted to angle my spine a bit more, I can maybe do this with the spine and maybe pull that up a bit. Actually, just a small change. And if I want to get back to that camera angle, I can go View, Bookmarks, and there's that bookmark that I had before. And it remembers that camera angle. Okay? So that's another thing that you can work with to have a fixed viewpoint and then still be able to work on things and then return to another viewpoint later on. Another way that you can work when you're doing these sorts of things and you want to have one particular angle that you're always working from is to just simply create another camera. And the way that you can create another camera is either in the Create menu, you've got cameras, or what I think is a much better way of working is to just open up your outliner, and at the moment I'm looking through my perspective camera, and you can grab that one in that particular orientation and just duplicate it. And the way you duplicate something is just a Control D, D for duplicate, or Command D if you're on a Macintosh. That takes a complete copy of that one in that same orientation, and if you want to look through that one, you go Panels, Perspective, and there's an extra camera, Perspective 1. It's exactly the same orientation, but you can always go back to your perspective view, work around looking at that perspective view, and then return to your original angle that you render from. Okay? So that's probably enough about the whole process of how we pose things and how we choose our silhouette and decide what our eventual render is going to look like. And as I said before, when you've finished and you're ready to submit this, you can either press Render, and that will give you a render from the particular camera angle that you're looking at the moment. Or you can take a screen grab. Screen grabs are also, they're nice, they're a little bit more involved. With the render, you've got your render, and then you can just right click on the render and then say Save Image. And you can choose the image type, most likely a JPEG. Call this one Frightened Pose, and that's been saved. To do a screen grab, you just press Print Screen, which is just above Insert. You've got your Home, Insert, Page Up, Page Down. There's Print Screen, and you'd have to open up a separate image processing package like Photoshop and paste that in and maybe crop around the outside if you want to have that same look. But it's entirely up to you which way you go. With Photoshop, you would first of all press the print screen button, and then we pause the recording. Okay, so in Photoshop, if you've done the print screen, just wait for it to respond. If the print screens work properly, when you go New, it should have approximately the same size as your screen anyway, and then you go Control V, and there's your character. Now, what you'd probably want to do is turn off the display of curves, so that's under the panel menu, Show Curves, and then you press Print Screen, and you can paste that in. So that's now pasted on the top of that one. That was the previous one there, that's that one there. And something handy as well, as I said, if you press 7, it gives you your silhouette, and you can print screen that one as well and paste that along the side. So now you can say select your silhouette and maybe invert the selection. Select, invert, and get rid of the background. So now you have your silhouette next to your pose as a nice reference as to how it's turned out. So you can select both of them and go Image Crop. So there's your pose and the silhouette to justify your selection of the pose and to see how well it works. So that's another way you can work with the output of your pose. I'll leave it up to you as to which way you choose to work. So if you can do that, as I said, for the different poses that I said, which were scared, worried, sleepy and excited, and see how you go.